When Karoline Leavitt took her seat on the stage, she knew she was walking into a battle. What she didn't expect was to walk out of it victorious. It happened live. No careful editing. No producers scrambling to smooth over the damage. Just an unfiltered moment unfolding in real time, one that would shatter the credibility of one of the most powerful TV hosts in America. Karoline had been invited onto Prime Debate, a show infamous for its brutal interrogations and a host who reveled in them. Across from her sat Paul Danning, a veteran journalist who had made a career out of cornering his guests, stripping them of their composure, and controlling every conversation. His interviews were traps. His questions, weapons. His goal wasn't discussion, it was dominance. And today, he thought he had the upper hand. But today, he wasn't just facing another guest. He was facing Karoline Leavitt, a rising conservative force, calculated, sharp, and ready to expose a truth he had spent years trying to bury. The lights overhead burned bright. The sleek backdrop of Prime Debate glowed behind them, the network's signature blue and white branding wrapping the studio in an aura of authority. Off-camera, producers monitored the live feed, their eyes darting between screens, fingers hovering over switches. This was the kind of segment the show thrived on: high stakes, high tension, and a guest who could be cornered, unraveled, made to slip. Paul Danning had done it 100 times before. He adjusted his posture, subtly angling forward. Not aggressive yet, but assertive. The cameras framed him just right, his voice perfectly modulated for the opening strike. "Let's talk about the responsibility of media, Karoline," he began, his tone the practiced blend of authority and concern. "Conservative outlets have built an empire on manufactured outrage, election fraud conspiracies, vaccine misinformation, the so-called war on free speech. Isn't it fair to say that networks like yours thrive not on truth, but on fear?" It was a setup, designed to force her onto the defensive. Karoline didn't take the bait. Instead, she exhaled softly, almost as if she were disappointed by the predictability of his approach. "That's an interesting argument, Paul," she said, her voice controlled, deliberate. "But if we're going to talk about fear-mongering, let's not pretend it's a one-sided issue." Paul's eyes flickered, just for a second. A silent acknowledgement that she wasn't rattled. Karoline folded her hands neatly in front of her, settling into her chair like someone who wasn't just prepared but in control. "Let's be clear," she continued. "Misinformation is a problem. But let's ask the real question: who gets to decide what qualifies as misinformation? Because if the past few years have shown us anything, it's that the so-called trusted media gets things wrong, a lot." Paul shifted, opening his mouth to counter, but Karoline didn't pause. She had already taken the reins. "Let's go down the list," she said, her voice smooth but unwavering. The Steele dossier, hailed as absolute truth, later debunked. The Covington Catholic students, portrayed as aggressors before the full video exonerated them. The Hunter Biden laptop story, dismissed as Russian propaganda, only to be verified 2 years later. And those are just the headlines, Paul. Paul lifted a hand as if to interject, but Karoline wasn't finished. "How many times have we seen mainstream outlets manipulate a story? How many times have key details been omitted, narratives crafted to fit a political agenda? How often does correction come only after the damage is done?" A beat of silence. Paul leaned back, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Karoline, those are isolated incidents. 3 examples in 10 seconds, she interrupted smoothly. "Want me to keep going?" The air in the studio changed. Even the crew could feel it. The debate was heating up. The controlled energy that had defined the early moments of the segment had started to erode, replaced by something sharper. More charged. Paul Danning leaned in, his voice measured but unmistakably firm. His words came not as an invitation to discussion, but as a challenge. His tone, once controlled, now carried the weight of a man who wasn't just debating, he was determined to win. "This is exactly the problem," he said, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. "People like you, always playing the victim, always pretending conservatives are under siege when in reality, it's your side that controls the conversation. Karoline didn't blink. Paul seized the moment, pressing harder. Let's be honest here, Karoline, he continued, his words deliberate, sharpened for effect. You claim media bias, but what you really mean is that you don't like being challenged. The second someone calls out the misinformation spread by conservative outlets, suddenly it's censorship. Suddenly you're being silenced. But let's look at the facts. Who really dominates the narrative? Who has built an entire industry around outrage? It's not us. Karoline exhaled slowly, but her composure remained intact. I see, she said, her voice controlled. So when mainstream outlets label stories as misinformation and then quietly correct themselves years later, that's accountability. But when conservatives challenge the narrative, it's dangerous. That's quite the double standard. Paul scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. Oh, come on. Are we really going to pretend that conservatives don't thrive on this persecution complex? The so-called war on free speech? Give me a break. You don't want fairness. You want to say whatever you want without consequences. Karoline didn't flinch. And you don't? Paul's smile was tight. The difference is, he said, we actually deal in facts. Karoline tilted her head slightly, a flicker of something passing through her eyes. Facts, she repeated. Like the Steele dossier? The Covington Catholic students? The Hunter Biden laptop? Paul let out a dry chuckle, but there was an edge to it now. Oh, please. The media got it wrong with argument? You're reaching, Karoline. The difference between us is that when mistakes happen, we correct them. Meanwhile, your side doubles down on conspiracy theories, peddles fear, and pretends they're victims. You don't care about truth. You care about controlling the conversation. The energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just an argument. This was a battle. Paul, Karoline said, her voice softer now, dangerously calm. Let me ask you something. Have you ever gotten it wrong? Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. I deal in facts, right? She nodded, as if considering that. So you stand by your record? By every word you've spoken on this show? Every claim? Paul straightened. Of course. And that was it. That was the moment. Karoline reached beside her, fingers resting on a neatly stacked pile of papers. Interesting, she said. Paul's confidence didn't falter. Not yet. But the crew felt it. The producers, who had been passively observing, exchanged quick glances. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Paul held his posture, but something in his expression had shifted, a flicker of calculation, the gears turning as he weighed his next move. The cameras were still rolling. The internet was watching. He wasn't a man who backed down easily. His entire career had been built on steering conversations, controlling narratives, keeping the upper hand. But this time, something was different. Karoline didn't press him immediately. She let the weight of the moment settle, let the silence stretch just long enough for anticipation to coil around the room like a wire pulled tight. Then, with deliberate precision, she lifted the sheet of paper from her stack. Paul, she said, her voice smooth, even. I want to read something to you. She held the document up just enough for the camera to catch the bolded headline, a direct quote from Paul Danning, from a private email leaked just hours before the broadcast. Verified. Circulating already. Making waves online. The words on the page weren't just a contradiction. They were damning. Paul's smile didn't falter, but it was thinner now, forced. His eyes flicked to the paper, then back to her. But he didn't lean forward this time. He stayed still, watching, waiting. Karoline didn't give him that luxury. This email was sent from your account, dated 6 months ago, she said. In it, you describe mainstream media's responsibility to control the messaging before the public forms the wrong conclusions. She glanced up, watching him closely. Would you like to explain what you meant by that? Paul inhaled sharply. I'm not sure where you're getting this from, but I don't comment on internal communications. That's convenient, Karoline interjected. Paul exhaled through his nose. Emails can be taken out of context. You know that. If you had any integrity, you'd acknowledge that pulling a single quote and spinning it is exactly what bad faith actors do to push a narrative. Karoline didn't blink. Oh, I agree. Context matters. She reached for another page. Which is why I also have the rest of the thread. Would you like me to read it? Paul's jaw tightened. From the control room, producers shifted, their expressions tense. They knew what was happening. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was exposure. It goes on to say, Karoline continued, flipping to the next page, we can't afford to let right-wing hysteria dictate the conversation, even if that means omitting inconvenient details until public sentiment is properly aligned. Paul's lips parted slightly, a rebuttal forming. But Karoline kept going. Most people won't fact-check. They all believe what we give them. That's why framing is everything. Silence. Not just in the studio. Across social media. Across living rooms. People weren't just watching anymore. They were absorbing. Paul let out a slow breath, forced his shoulders back. This is ridiculous. You cherry-picking phrases from private conversations. Private conversations that prove exactly what you accuse my side of doing, Karoline cut in. Manufacturing narratives. Controlling perception. Deciding what the public gets to believe. Paul let out a short, sharp laugh, but it was empty. Oh, come on, Karoline. If you think a few leaked emails prove some grand conspiracy, then you know better than the people who cry about deep state shadow governments and stolen elections. You know what this is? This is desperate. Karoline tilted her head slightly. Desperate? She repeated. Paul scoffed. You're reaching, and you know it. You can take a few out-of-context lines and spin them however you want, but anyone with half a brain can see what you're doing. This is just another bad faith smear job. Is it? She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Then why, she continued, is your network in full damage control right now? Paul hesitated, a second, but a second was all it took. Even as he tried to keep his composure, somewhere in the background, a producer was already pacing. Somewhere in the control room, an executive was already making a call. They weren't waiting for the fallout. It had already begun. And Paul Dunning, for the first time in his career, wasn't holding the reins. The weight of the moment pressed in. Paul's jaw tensed, his fingers tapping against the desk, small, controlled movements betraying the storm brewing beneath the surface. His silence didn't last long. You know what's funny, Karoline? His voice carried a strained edge, like a taut rope moments from snapping. You sit there acting like you've uncovered some grand scandal when in reality, this is just another carefully staged performance. Manufactured outrage. Selective leaks. Cheap theatrics. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. People like you don't debate. You don't challenge ideas. You hunt scalps. And let's not pretend this was ever about the truth. This was about getting your viral moment. About feeding your audience the narrative they crave. Karoline met his gaze, impassive. Paul exhaled sharply, leaning forward. Because that's what this really is, isn't it? A game. You push, you poke, you prod until someone slips. Then you frame it just right, clip it just short enough, and unleash it on the internet like a pack of wolves. His words picked up speed, the restraint he had clung to slipping through his fingers. And you know what? I'm sick of it. I'm sick of the bad faith outrage. I'm sick of people pretending to be victims while they hold the loudest megaphone in the room. And I am especially sick of you sitting there, smug, as if you're exposing some great hypocrisy when in reality, you are the hypocrite. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Karoline's posture remained unchanged. She didn't react. She didn't need to. But the rest of the studio did. The control room, once a quiet hum of activity, had stilled. Producers exchanged glances, their monitors now flooded with live reactions from the network's internal channels. Some stared at their screens, reading messages in real time. Others, those who had worked with Paul for years, watched with something closer to quiet resignation. This wasn't just another heated debate. This was a collapse in motion. Paul, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shift, pushed on. Go ahead, Karoline. Enjoy your moment. Read your little leaked emails. Cherry-pick your lines. Watch the internet lap it up. But let's get one thing straight, whatever happens after this, that's on you. His voice, once a steady weapon of control, now wavered. Karoline exhaled slowly, as if considering his words. Then, for the first time, she leaned forward, closing the space between them. That's where you're wrong, Paul, she said softly. Whatever happens after this, it was never up to me. Paul blinked. Then he saw it. The producer by the teleprompter, staring at their phone, face pale. The assistant director, hand pressed to their earpiece, nodding tightly before whispering something to the person beside them. Then, from the corner of his vision, one of the network executives stepping into the control room. Something in his stomach turned cold. The weight of the silence was unbearable. Paul could feel it pressing in, stretching the moment too long, making the air heavier than it had any right to be. The control he had spent years perfecting, the ability to dictate the rhythm of a debate, to maneuver around difficult moments, was slipping. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He straightened slightly, exhaling through his nose. This entire conversation is exactly the problem. His voice was steady, but something in it had shifted, like a thread pulled too tight. Conservatives have made a business out of claiming persecution, out of pushing this absurd idea that they're being silenced. It's exhausting. Maybe if they spent less time complaining and more time contributing, we wouldn't be having this discussion in the first place. The words left his mouth before he could measure their weight. A single second passed, just long enough for realization to set in. Then Karoline tilted her head. Her expression didn't change, but something sharpened in her eyes. Are you saying conservatives don't contribute to society, Paul? Paul shifted slightly, adjusting in his seat. I'm saying this non-stop whining about being cancelled is nothing but a distraction. Karoline didn't respond immediately. She just watched him. Not arguing. Not pressing. Just waiting. That was worse. Because the damage had already been done. And beyond the walls of the studio, the world was already reacting. It started the way these things always did, a clip, a segment, a 15-second snippet stripped of context was making its rounds at breakneck speed. Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, it was all people needed to hear. No introduction. No additional context. Just that one damning line. The outrage was instant. Within minutes, the hashtag started gaining traction, a hashtag #FirePaulDunning, hashtag #ChachoMedia bias exposed, hashtag Karoline was right. The internet churned through its familiar cycle, rage, reaction, counter-reaction. Some took the clip at face value, slamming Paul for what they saw as open contempt for half the country. Others scrambled to explain, insisting it was an unfair framing of his argument. Then the full clip surfaced. And it didn't help his case. If anything, it made it worse. The tone. The dismissiveness. The way Paul had leaned back, exhaling, as if the entire premise of the conversation exhausted him. The way he had delivered the words as a fact, not an argument. Political commentators pounced. For conservatives, it was proof, confirmation of everything they had been saying about the media's disdain for them. For liberals, it was a mess. Some doubling down, others quietly stepping away as the backlash spiraled. And then, as it always did, the sponsors got involved. By midday, the first three advertisers had issued statements, not outright distancing themselves, not yet, but choosing their words carefully. We are aware of the concerns raised and are currently evaluating our partnership with Prime Debate. It was a neutral statement, designed to buy time. But in this climate, neutrality wasn't safety. By evening, 5 more had followed. The network was scrambling. Damage control meetings were happening behind closed doors. Executives were calculating just how much fallout they could afford to weather. Karoline didn't issue a statement. She didn't go on a victory lap. She simply retweeted the clip. No caption, no elaboration, just a single thinking face emoji. And that was enough. Because the fire had already been lit. And now, it was spreading. The backlash wasn't fading. It was accelerating. Inside the headquarters of Prime Debate's parent network, executives sat in a war room that had been hastily assembled overnight. The email inbox was flooded with messages, angry viewers demanding action, advertisers pressing for answers, legal teams advising caution. What had started as a social media storm had transformed into something bigger, more dangerous. Advertisers weren't just pausing sponsorships anymore. They were pulling out entirely. And to make matters worse, rival networks had seized the moment. Panel after panel dissecting Paul Danning's words, using him as the latest case study on media arrogance, journalistic bias, and the inevitable reckoning of unchecked egos. By mid-morning, an emergency meeting was called. The network had two options: defend Paul and risk hemorrhaging what little goodwill they had left, or cut him loose and salvage their reputation. It wasn't an easy decision. For years, Paul had been one of their star personalities, a veteran journalist, a name synonymous with hard-hitting, aggressive interviews. But now, he wasn't an asset. He was a liability. And liabilities got dealt with. At 3 p.m., the first domino fell. A carefully worded statement hit the network's official channels. Paul Danning has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review of yesterday's broadcast. Prime Debate remains committed to respectful and fair journalism. Corporate speak for, and we're waiting to see how bad this gets before we throw him overboard. But the internet had zero patience for half measures. Suspension wasn't enough. They wanted termination. And Karoline? She wasn't leading the charge. But she wasn't stopping it either. Later that evening, she appeared on another program. A different host. A different show. One that was now gaining record viewership thanks to the controversy that had consumed the industry. She was asked the inevitable question, "Do you think Paul Danning should be fired?" A pause. Just long enough. Then, measured, precise, and devastating, she responded. I think people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words. It was strategic. It was unshakable. And it sealed his fate. The next morning, 9:15 a.m., the network made its final decision. A new statement was issued, one with no room for ambiguity. Effective immediately, Paul Danning is no longer affiliated with Prime Debate. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. It was over. The media world erupted. Some called it justice. Others called it an overreaction. Paul Danning's firing wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The country wasn't just watching. It was dividing. For some, his downfall was a long overdue reckoning, proof that mainstream media figures were no longer untouchable. That they couldn't speak with thinly veiled contempt and expect the public to just take it. To them, Paul's words hadn't been a simple slip-up. They had been a revelation. A glimpse into the underlying elitism that had shaped the industry. Decades, and now for the first time, there were consequences. But for others, this was something far more insidious: a veteran journalist erased over one bad moment, an entire career discarded because of one clip, one soundbite. So this is where we are now, they asked. One wrong sentence, and you're gone. What happened to debate? What happened to context? It didn't take long for conservative media to take advantage. Headlines on Fox News, The Daily Wire, and Newsmax framed Karoline as the woman who brought down Paul Danning. Segments dissected the firing, turning it into a cultural flashpoint. Was this about accountability, or was this about silencing dissent? Meanwhile, Paul's former allies in the mainstream press kept their distance. Some dismissed him outright: he had made his bed. Others, though, were less certain. Because if Paul Danning could be fired overnight, then who else was on borrowed time? Then, late one night, Paul broke his silence. No network, no polished studio, just a single video uploaded straight to social media. The lighting was dim, his voice steady but heavy, his expression defiant. They fired me because I refused to play along. Because I told the truth. The media doesn't want truth. They want control. Step out of line, and they erase you. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who dares to challenge the narrative. The video spread at lightning speed. Within hours, millions had watched. His supporters rallied behind him, calling for boycotts against prime debate. His critics pushed back, pointing out that this wasn't some grand conspiracy: he had been fired because he went too far. But the battle lines had been drawn. And Karoline? She stayed silent. No comments. No interviews. No engagement. She didn't have to, because the world was arguing for her. But as the days passed, the conversation shifted. This wasn't just about Paul anymore. It was about something bigger: the power of outrage, the fragility of public discourse, the way social media could elevate, destroy, and reshape reality in a matter of hours. Media outlets scrambled to keep up, running think pieces, panel discussions, and roundtable debates. Was this justice, or was it censorship? Some argued that Paul's firing was necessary accountability. This isn't about free speech, one commentator wrote. It's about professionalism. Words have weight, and if a journalist crosses the line, they face the consequences. But others weren't so sure. The issue isn't that Paul Danning lost his job, another article warned. It's what this means for the future. Are we punishing people for mistakes, or are we silencing people for having the wrong opinions? The debate stretched beyond Paul and Karoline. It became about the role of the media, about who controls the narrative, about where the line is, and who gets to draw it. And Paul? He was out, but he wasn't done. Within a month, he launched his own show on YouTube, rebranding himself as a truth-teller cast out for speaking against the establishment. His audience? Bigger than ever. And Karoline? She moved on. But her name would always be tied to this moment. Because this wasn't just about winning a debate, it was about changing the game. So now, the question remains. Was this justice served, or was this a dangerous precedent? Did Paul's firing restore accountability, or did it prove that public pressure controls the media? And most importantly, who decides what crosses the line? Because one thing is certain. This won't be the last time something like this happens. And when it does, the question remains, whose side will you be on?